If you haven't already, I want to invite you to open up to John 13 with me this morning. We're going to be continuing in our series in John. We've been doing this for a while. We are hitting a stride here in this series as we've studied the Gospel of John. And as we talked about the last few weeks, chapter 12 in John's Gospel was kind of a hinge, if you will, that opened a new door to kind of the next phase of what John is working through. And as we close the door on chapter 12, we close the door on Jesus' public ministry, and we really zero in on this conversation that Jesus has just amongst his 12 disciples. The public's not here. The Pharisees aren't here. This is just Jesus with his guys, his followers, those that he's closest with, having a discussion with them. And what we'll learn over the coming weeks, over the next few chapters of John's Gospel, is that Jesus is going to, really what he's doing is sharing some final marching orders, if you will, with his disciples. He knows that his time is coming to an end. He knows that he's going to be departing. He's going to go to the cross, and following the cross, he will go back to be with the Father. And so giving his disciples some instructions on what does life look like when I'm gone, and also some great reassurance to them of the hope that they can still have, because as we'll see over the next couple weeks, they're going to get some news that is quite startling to them, news that for them they're going to be wrestling with and wondering, how in the world are we supposed to make all this work? I thought there was more work to be done. So the question kind of arises here as we look near the end of Jesus' life. How do his disciples go about carrying on the mission that they've been on here? They've been rocking the world, if you will, out in the Middle East, in that region, especially down near Jerusalem, where so many people were struggling with the teachings of Jesus, struggling with everything that he did. Some people believing in him, following him, getting excited about what he is all about, and his disciples here being part of all of that, now wrestling with these questions. How do we carry on? How do we continue when you're gone? What is this whole mission supposed to look like? And here in chapter 13, before we kind of get into a whole lot, Jesus kind of starts things off with what we're going to call a living parable. And I laughed earlier because in theology class we coined a new living parable this morning. We'll leave that for another time. But Jesus works out this living parable, as some commentators have called it, this interaction with his disciples. They're sitting down before the Passover feast, having a meal together, which would have looked very different from our meals today, where we sit at a table in chairs and all comfortable, and they would have sat on the floor with a lower table with their feet reclined out and their bodies closer to the table, reclining with one another, eating and stuff as they would do. And it's during this meal that we are told that Jesus has this interaction, this living parable, if you will, that's going to teach so much about what he's come to do and so much about what he's calling his disciples to do as he leaves. To give you a bit of an example outside of this passage of the significance of a living parable, I was thinking back to when I was an underclassman in high school. I was still at Aurora Christian, and I remember there was one day at basketball practice that one of the coaches was really getting on all the guys because some guys were just really not taking it seriously, kind of slacking off, being a little lazy, especially when we were doing our conditioning. You know, that was the one thing I always hated it when coaches like get on the line. You're like, oh, here we go, and we'd been on the line for a little while, and Coach Davidson was just really after some guys about making sure, hey, you need to hustle. And there was one of the teammates in particular who was just kind of dogging it, really not with it. And you knew that the table had turned when Coach Davidson said, all right, I'm going to run with you guys. He wasn't a young coach. Coach Davidson was probably 65, at least at the time. And so big dude. And when he gets on the baseline and dials up with the rest of the team, high school guys, you're like, what's going on here? I remember being a little bit concerned because I knew he wasn't in the greatest of shape. Here's an old guy about to run it down and back, and I'm like, is he going to be okay? You know, is this going to work out all right? And he says, go. And we all run to half court and run back, and to the great surprise of many people, he beat the one student, the one athlete, that had been dogging it. And you're like, wow. In that moment, him doing that physical activity, engaging physically in that conditioning, really taught the team something. So much it's stuck with me to today, right? And it got our attention. Likewise, when Jesus has this interaction with the disciples, it's more than him, like the coach, saying, guys, hustle, hustle, hustle. Getting on the line and challenging gets the attention in a whole new way. So rather than Jesus just coming on the scene and talking about what it is to serve and this attitude the disciples are supposed to have, he exercises this living parable where he engages with it and physically demonstrates something that to them, in their context, would have been even more startling than seeing my 65-year-old coach get on the baseline and run it down and back. To them, seeing what Jesus has done here, it threw everything at them. It would have totally gripped their attention. Why is their teacher? Why is their master, the one that they are following, their superior? Why on earth is he washing their feet? That would not have happened. The guys, you got to picture them sitting around the table, like suddenly the discussion comes to a halt. And all attention turns to Jesus. What's he doing? Now in Luke 22, I think he gives us a little bit of context for what's going on here. Luke 22 is talking about this same kind of deal as Jesus sitting with his disciples, sharing that meal with them before the Passover. And Luke tells us that a dispute in that time had risen among his disciples. And this dispute, if you're familiar with the Gospels, is the disciples kind of arguing with each other. Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of God? Who should be considered the greatest? And so here are these guys doing life with Jesus, rubbing shoulders with him, and they're like, hey, I think I should be the greatest. Or maybe John should be considered the greatest of the disciples. No, Matthew certainly. I mean, you can just imagine the conversation that's going on, and you kind of picture Jesus sitting back quietly, just letting them go about this discussion, talking through it, arguing perhaps with each other, and then Jesus just quietly gets up from the table, and John tells us that he goes and he takes off his outer garments, and he puts a towel around his waist, grabs a basin of water, and he goes and he kneels down by his disciples and begins washing their feet. And you just picture all of this happening without Jesus saying a word. In the midst of this, who's the greatest? Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of God? Jesus does the unthinkable and becomes the least in their circumstances, because to kneel down, to take on the form of a servant, if you will, and to wash someone's feet would have been to become the lowest of the low. That task of washing someone's feet was considered in the Jewish culture something so menial, so unbecoming, so humiliating, that it was reserved for the lowest of the servants in the house. As a matter of fact, there were some Jews that even believed that it was unbecoming of a Jew to wash the feet of another Jew. They would leave that to the Gentile servants. They'd let the children deal with that. But no Jewish man would wash the feet of another Jewish man. It was so humbling of a task. And so Jesus, can't you just picture the power in that circumstances? Here they are, who's the greatest? And the greatest among them becomes the least. And you almost can get into the thoughts of the disciples in that moment. Whoa. Jesus would tell them in Luke, he says that the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors, but not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is greater, one who reclines at the table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines? But I am among you as the one who serves. So this interaction between Jesus and his disciples, so incredibly powerful. But more than calling his guys to hustle and get on the line and give it their all, Jesus in this, because Jesus is so profound in everything that he does, There's so much that he's communicating with them. So as we look at this living parable, as you will, in John 13, there's much that Jesus is conveying, much that he is demonstrating. First and foremost, as we look at John 13, we recognize that in this interaction with his disciples, this is a fundamental sign of Jesus' love for them. What a sign of his love for them. Look at the beginning of this passage. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, and get this, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, they had come from God, he was going back to God, he rose from supper, laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. So here you have John, one of the closest of Jesus' disciples, reflecting back on these final hours with his Savior, these final hours with his teacher with them. And as he does so, he looks back and he says, man, did not Jesus love us to the end? He loved us to the end, and he reflects back on these things, no doubt even looking at this very interaction as this great demonstration of Jesus' love, because to them in that culture, as we talked about the significance of the Jews not even doing that, the only time a Jewish man would do this for another Jewish man would have been to demonstrate the deepest of love for them, the deepest of respect for them. And so John, looking at what Jesus has done, says, man, he has certainly loved us, his own, his disciples, to the end. That in the final hours of his life, Jesus would spend it with his guys, with his disciples, behind closed doors, giving them instruction, reassuring them, letting them know what all is to come. And here, John is like, he has loved us to the end. And that statement, loved them to the end, can be understood probably in two different ways. Number one, you could understand it temporally. Right? That in the aspect of time, Jesus loved his disciples all the way up to the end of his life. That even in these final moments of his life, looking ahead to the cross and all of the agony, all of the pain, all of the suffering that was to come at the cross, all that would mean physically, spiritually, yet Jesus served and loved his disciples. He loved them to the very end, absolutely. But secondly, you could understand this statement kind of figuratively, if you could, that he loved them to the uttermost, that he loved them to the absolute most possible. That as John looks back, how could he have loved us any more? He gave everything. He became nothing. And so we see here this profound love of Jesus Christ, this great love that John looks back to, and it causes me to think of what Jesus will say within, in their time, just a couple of short moments. For us, we're not going to talk about it for a few more weeks. But in John 15:13, Jesus will say to his disciples, greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends. Greater love has no one than this, that you laid down your life for your friends. And surely as we look at a statement like that, we're like, man, that totally hits it. And we probably start thinking through our heads, who would I be willing to die for? My spouse? My kids? My grandkids? Perhaps we have a friend that we love so dearly that we would be willing to lay our life down for them. Who do we love that we would lay our life down for? And we start to measure things simply by laying down our physical life. Who would we go to the death for? And in some ways, is not that the easier question to answer? Because how often are you and I placed in circumstances where we are staring death in the face on behalf of somebody else? Not that often. Unless you're living a crazier life than I am. I know I'm not all the time finding myself like, I could die right now for this person. I've not had to weigh that cost. But surely there's the other side of that, no greater love than one who lays down his life for his friends, in that figurative sense. That you would become nothing for somebody else. That you would empty yourself on behalf of another. Surely we deal with that every day, don't we? Now you're dealing with something that hits home on Monday morning. Now you're dealing with something that hits home throughout your week. Now you're dealing with something that hits home when you're looking at any person who's in front of you. Whether at church, at work, in your community, in your family, surely now that takes on a new meaning because you're not talking about physically dying, but dying to yourself to serve somebody else. And what a great demonstration of love that this is. And Jesus has modeled both. He has given us, as his followers, the model of not only just laying down his life. What a great act of love that the God of the universe would lay down his life for you and I. How humbling is that for us? But that Jesus would take on human flesh, that he would become nothing. He would empty himself on our behalf. What greater love is there than that? Jesus surely loved his own to the end. And this puts in perspective for us when Paul will write in 1 Corinthians 13 about love, and most of us have that plastered around our homes or on our social media pages, and we think of 1 Corinthians 13 as the romance chapter, right? The chapter of love, but Paul didn't have that in mind. Paul just had genuine Christian love. When Paul speaks of love in 1 Corinthians 13, he's not talking about the love that you have for your spouse or a significant other. Paul's talking about the love that we have for one another as Christians. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. And in that very passage, Paul says that love does not insist on its own way. In other words, if you were to kind of take up this summary of Paul's definition of love, this Christian love, this love that Jesus embodied, it is a love that is selfless. It is a love that is not about us. It is not about the person who loves, but seeks the best for the one who is loved. And so surely as we look at Jesus' interaction with his disciples while he was here on earth, and we understand what he has done for us even today, surely we can see and proclaim, has Jesus not loved us to the end? Has he not loved us to the uttermost? He who's worthy of our praise and our worship and our devotion became humble and loved even us. Holy cow. Romans 5:8. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You ever let that sink in for just a second? While we were still sinners. See, this whole mantra and mindset that in some ways we can merit or earn the love and affection of Christ. Baloney. While we were still sinners. In other words, you could translate that perhaps as while we were enemies of God. While we were living in rebellion to God. While we brought nothing to the table, God so loved us that he sent his Son. He loved us in such a way that he would take on human flesh and dwell among us and go to the cross. Greater love has no one than this, than one lay down his life for his friend. John looks back on his time with Jesus, says, surely he loved them to the end. He loved them to the end. So in this very act, as Jesus serves and humbles himself with his disciples and washes their feet, an assurance to them, he loves us. He loves us. And that would have hit differently than Jesus just saying, guys, I love you. Because for those of us who know perhaps what your love language may be, you know that sometimes those acts that people do for us, the different things that they do, go a long way in conveying and communicating just how much somebody truly cares and how much they love. And for Jesus to do such a radical thing would have shouted to those guys, wow, he has loved us to the end. Secondly, there's some deep symbolism in what Jesus is doing here. I'm going to start by talking about the symbolism of his humiliation, if you will. If you look at our passage, verse 3, Jesus knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God. Okay, verse 4, he rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around his waist and poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that he had wrapped around him. Let me ask you, how would God incarnate? How would God in the flesh convey to his disciples the extent of his humiliation in taking on flesh? But by going into their own culture, their own understanding, and becoming the least to them. That as Jesus literally takes on the form of a servant, no longer is he a house guest. He becomes like a servant, taking off the outer garments, putting on the towel. He would have looked like a servant in the home. He takes on the form of a servant and serves. As if to convey, again, remind his disciples of what he has come to do. As Jesus would say, I did not come to be served, but to serve. Right? The humiliation of Christ to empty himself and take on human flesh, as we've talked about earlier in this series. How can we really wrap our heads around that? How can we wrap our heads around the extent to which Jesus humbled himself even just to come? Even just to become human and walk among us? What a great humiliation that he would humble himself even to those standards. And so, as he does this, we are told that he comes to Simon Peter, which, as we know from just reading the Gospel, Simon's kind of the fiery guy of the bunch, right? And Jesus comes to him and he says to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? And on one hand, you might be tempted to say, well, maybe let's give Peter the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he's asking Jesus, can you wash mine too? Like, he's washed a couple of the other guys. He's like, my feet are a little dirty. They could use a little touch-up, a little sparkle. That's not the attitude that Peter had. The attitude that he has is, what do you think you're doing washing my feet? You shouldn't be doing this. There's no way that you should be washing my feet. And Jesus responds to him. He says, what I am doing you do not understand now, but afterwards you will understand. This tells us, this should shout to us right away that what Jesus is doing, he is demonstrating something to his disciples that they will not understand in that moment, but that in time they'll get. Hence the symbolism of Jesus' activity here. But Peter presses Jesus after he says, you should never wash my feet. I will never let you wash my feet. You'll never do it. It's not happening. And Jesus turns right away. And he says, listen, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. If I don't wash you, you have no share with me. And it's like Peter's attitude flips like on a dime. Holy cow. Okay. And Jesus is conveying to them then the symbolism of what he's about to do on the cross. The symbolism of his cleansing work, not just to wash feet, but Jesus come to cleanse far more than that. He will go on. Peter will respond and say, well, if that's the case, then Lord, not just my feet, but my hands, my head. In other words, okay, if I need to be washed by you, then you might as well just wash everything, because I don't want to lose in my share with you. I want to be with you. I want to have my share. I don't want to be apart from you, so surely wash all of me. And Jesus responds and says, the one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And so this symbolism, if you will, is Jesus conveying these things that what he is going to do on the cross will cleanse not just their feet, but it will cleanse their hearts, it will cleanse their souls, it will cleanse them from sin and wickedness that has permeated their entire beings, that Jesus will make things new. But this work that he will do is one that's not going to be done multiple times. Like you and I, most of us probably showered this morning or last night, and we'll do it again. And we will continue to shower, hopefully. Hopefully. If you're talking about middle school students, maybe not as frequently. That's not the idea that it comes to our spiritual cleansing in Christ. The scriptures are clear. It's a once and for all. Once and for all. Hebrews 10:12, but when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins. Yeah, there is the reality that this week and in this moment even perhaps we'll stumble, we'll fall, and we'll go to the Lord and we'll confess our sins. Our fellowship may be broken, but we will be cleansed. We are cleansed once and for all. One action, one turning to the Lord. There's not a sense in the scriptures of being saved over and over and over again. I remember as a kid growing up always fearing that. Maybe I'm not really saved. I've been struggling a little bit lately. I've been doing bad. And I'd go back and I'd confess all my sins again and ask for salvation and forgiveness. Little did I understand the monumental work that Christ has done in cleansing me, transforming me. That though I am not perfect, my sins have been made white as snow. He has washed them away. And we know that this act with his disciples is merely a symbolism for what's to come, because who's in their midst? Judas. Judas is in their midst. Surely, you got to picture the disciples looking back on this interaction later. After Judas is gone and done what he's going to do, he betrays Christ. And they look back, and you got to imagine this moment where like, wait, Jesus washed Judas's feet too? It wasn't the washing of their feet that really made them clean. That's why Jesus says, and you are clean, speaking of the guys. He says, not every one of you. Not all of you are clean, because he knew the one who would betray him. And so it shows us that even in this interaction, yes, there's some deep symbolism for what Christ is going to do on the cross. There's the sign that he has loved them, but also this idea that Jesus is setting a new standard for his disciples, that what are you to do when I leave? How are you to live? Who's the greatest among you? The one who becomes the least. And so as we see, as Jesus finishes up washing their feet, verse 12, and you can just picture the time that goes by, because as we read this in verse 12, just happens immediately, but as they're sitting there in the room, it would have taken some time for Jesus to go around and wash every single one of the disciples' feet. And so you have these moments where the disciples are sitting there thinking, pondering, processing what's going on. Jesus said to Peter, you don't understand what's happening now. And then as he wraps up, he takes the towel off, puts on the outer garment again, and he reclines at the table with them again. And he says, do you understand what I have done to you? And you got to wonder if the guy's just sitting there like, no. I don't really get it yet. Why did you do that? And Jesus will go on, say, okay, you call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should follow, right? And so Jesus levels the playing field, if you will. There is no one greater. If I, as your teacher, have done this, you ought to do it too. Because you are not greater than your teacher. No messenger is greater than the one who sends them, Jesus says. So if he has done these things, if he has emptied himself and humbled himself in such a way to serve others, he says, that's your new standard. None of you are greater than another. None of you are above something. Now, couple years ago, this would have been more than 3 years ago, probably now at this point, I was still at the Sugar Grove campus. And part of my role there was overseeing the First Impressions ministry, which involved the parking team. Okay, and one Sunday we happened to be a little short on guys out in the parking lot. And so I was like, all right, Chris, I'll come out. And so I'm out there in the parking lot helping park cars. So this guy's walking in, and he walks by me. He's like, what are you doing out here parking cars? Don't you have something better to be doing? Like, as if parking cars was for like the okay, you got nothing else to do, so we'll put you in the parking lot idea. And I want to give the guy the benefit of the doubt. I'm sure he meant well with what he was saying, but I just remember sitting there thinking, like, man, he's totally missed it. What do you mean I've got better things to do? Like, who am I? Am I really above parking cars? In my head, I never thought anything of it. This is how I can serve. This is what I can do. I'll park some cars. What's the big deal? And I wonder if there's not that mentality around the church at times. Who are you to be doing this? I wonder if we're really honest with ourselves, if we don't ponder at times, maybe it's not for me to get on my knees and wash the toilets. Because let's be honest, I don't want to do that. But am I really above it? Are any of us above anything? Now, that doesn't mean that all of us should be doing everything. Paul talks about the body of Christ. We all have different strengths. We have different giftings, and I want to be true to that. But in the spirit of humility, Jesus sets a standard that says, guys, we're not above things. Who are we to not empty ourselves and to serve others? And not just in the sense of a corporate serving, helping around the church and with the church's functions, but in your own life. Who are you to not be the one who loves and serves the least of these? Who are you that says, I'm so great that I don't need to serve and love that unlovable, challenging person? Jesus would. Jesus did. And if he did, surely we should follow in his footsteps. He calls his disciples to imitate him. I've given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. So does that mean that as we gather, at church, we take our shoes off on the way in, and here we sit around, and your elders will come around and wash your feet on Sunday mornings, or in our small group gatherings? Bill's looking like, that's not happening, guys. I love you all, but not happening. It wasn't literally, guys, wash each other's feet, but the spirit in what Jesus did. The attitude that he had. Surely Jesus wasn't telling his disciples, hey, you need to cleanse each other from your sins, right? Because that was something unique to Jesus. So if we were to break down what Jesus is calling his disciples to do, it is to serve and love people with great humility. Let's start there. None of us have arrived. We keep that spirit of humility in everything that we do. I am here to serve. I am here to serve. For those who've been around for a long time, I know that was one of Pastor Phil's mantras, right? I'm here to serve you. I'm here to serve you. He talks about that all the time. We're all here to serve, however we may be called upon by the Lord. Would we do so humbly, and would we do so with a good attitude, right? Because I know that there are times in life where God may call us to do something that in the moment isn't exactly the most fun thing to do. But we will be humble enough to submit ourselves to what he's called us to, and to do so with a good attitude. Because I can go through and do something out of duty and task, but with a bad attitude, and am I really doing it right? Or even when I'm doing the things that I know the Lord has put before me, am I willing to say, Lord, this isn't exactly what I'd have on my agenda for today, but you've put it here. So I'll do it to the best of my ability. I'll do it with the best attitude that I can have, because it's not about serving the other people. I'm serving you. And you're worthy of it all. You're worthy of it all. And so we do so with humility. This service and love that we have for other people is selfless. It's selfless. See, it's not about me. When I'm serving other people, when I'm to love another person, it's not about Jeremy anymore. Tom, it's not about Tom. It's not about you fill in your name. When you are called to serve in God's kingdom, it's not about you. It's about the Lord. It's about putting other people first. And so we ask the question, who's at the center of your motivation? When you boil everything down, what lies at the heart of why you serve and why you love somebody? Is it because you stand to gain something from it? Do they serve as some benefit to you? You're going to say, I'll be nice to this person, because if I'm nice to them, then, I got the in. They owe me one. Or is it selfless to say, it ain't about me. I don't care. If I don't get anything back out of this, I will give it my all. I will still give it my all. And I want to just take a minute here and challenge some of the common thinking. And I want to preface, before I get into it, I want to preface this by saying, by no means am I saying that we should say yes to everything. Hear me now, okay? You will say no to things, and you should say no to things. But often when we are faced with opportunities and callings to serve personally, corporately, whatever, we have different things and many different reasons that we may say no to something. And I want to challenge the premise that sometimes our reasons are not great reasons. That we don't always embody this idea that Jesus has called us to come and to follow in his footsteps, to become the lowest of the servants, to serve others. So I want to look at a few words here. I'll start with convenience. Because isn't that something that we use kind of as a metric, if we will, in our own lives? If we're asked to serve in some way, or someone comes up and says, hey man, I really need some help, or you fill in the blank, whatever that may be, a family member or whatever, isn't convenience part of what goes into that? Because we're going to stop and weigh, what are you asking me to give here? What's the cost to me in this? And so we start to weigh the cost benefit like we do with our investments, don't we? Okay, if I'm going to put this much in, what do I really gain out of it? And so we start to just evaluate sometimes based on how convenient is it for me to serve somebody, to love somebody in this way. And oftentimes it's going to tax us a lot, isn't it? And sometimes those are the times we're like, that ain't going to be easy, and it may not be fun. I'm out. It's not going to work right now. And there will be times where that is legitimate. But to truly serve someone, to truly love somebody selflessly, there will be cost to it. And if you look at your life and are unwilling to pay that cost, then perhaps there's reason to evaluate whether or not you're following in Jesus' footsteps. Think of what it cost Jesus, if you will, to do all that he's done, to serve. James tells us that what good is it to go to somebody and say, hey, I hope you're warm today. I hope you got a lot of food to eat, when you're sitting and looking at somebody who you know they don't have another pair of clothes, you don't have food in their fridge. What good is it to say that to that person if you're not going to give them lunch? If you're not willing to buy them an outfit to wear? There will be a cost to serving and loving other people. Self-sacrifice is a marker of Christian discipleship as we follow Jesus. Second word, comfort. Comfort. You ever been asked to do something that you're like, whoa, dude, that is way outside my comfort zone, right? Talk to a lot of people who just call it what it is. They feel that way about middle schoolers. Respect that, get that. They're like, not my thing, okay? That's outside my comfort zone. I've done a lot of things the Lord has called me to that are outside my comfort zone, and many times on a weekly basis. Just because something's going to be uncomfortable, just because something's going to stretch us, doesn't mean we say no to it. Sometimes those are the opportunities that God is using to stretch you a little bit, to grow you, to develop you. Comfort's not always a bad thing, but oftentimes it's used and viewed as this means by which we can kind of stay and, I'm good, like here. I'll maybe wiggle a little bit, but I'm not going too far. Commitment. Now we're getting legitimate here. Look at the world we live in today. If I were to ask each of you, how are you doing? The common mantra is, I'm busy. Fine. I'm busy. We have a lot going on. And we do, to some extent. You got kids, they're in different sports, they're all over the place, different extracurriculars. You're involved with a lot of stuff going on. You got family things taking place, your appointments, you got work, everything lines up, and you're like, dude, sometimes we find ourselves overcommitted. And so we find an opportunity where we now are called to or have an opportunity to serve somebody, to love somebody, and we don't have the means to do that because we're so overcommitted. And there are times, and a lot of times, hear me on this, that's legit. To say no to something because you don't have the capacity to add another thing to your list. What we don't want is a bunch of people going around that are just so overcommitted that you're spread so thin that you can't give your all to the things that you're involved in. Do the best. Know your boundaries. Know your limits. But sometimes there's a need to evaluate our commitments because just because we're committed, just because we're overcommitted, doesn't mean that all those commitments are legit and good. Sometimes we need to reprioritize. Because if we don't have the means in our life to be able to serve and to love somebody else, then we should step back and say, hold on, maybe I am committed to too many different things. I wonder at times if busyness isn't one of the great tools of the enemy to attack Christianity and the church. If I can just get them so busy that maybe they won't have time to serve each other, maybe they won't have time to engage in the kingdom work that God's doing in their personal lives and in their corporate lives as the church. I just wonder. So I think it's healthy for us to stop and evaluate our commitments. Okay, this season, this is where I'm at. I remember talking with a friend saying, hey, you know what? I could see myself going for a master's degree someday. And a friend tells me, not now. Not now. You're right. You're right. It's okay to know your limits, to know your capacity, but continue to evaluate. Okay, am I best utilizing the time and efforts that God's given me now? Or do I need to readjust? Lastly, what about competency? Are you able to do the job? Do you have the skill set? Listen, if some of you guys asked me to build a website, I'd be like, you're asking the wrong guy. Not my thing. We know our skills. Sometimes, though, especially if we're not so sure of the skills that God's given us, try some things out. Just because you look at it and you're like, oh, dude, there ain't no way. Doesn't mean that God can't develop you. God can't train you and equip you to do those things. Sometimes I wonder if we don't say no to a lot of great opportunities that God's given because we doubt the power of God at work in our lives. I can't do that. Oh, but could God do it through you? Maybe. Maybe. What's your competency? Are you willing to let God stretch you and develop you and train you? But know your gifts. Paul says in Romans 12, don't think too highly of yourself, but with sober judgment, according to the measure of faith that God has given you. It's okay at times to say, you know what? If Tom's joked with me before, Jeremy, what about serving on the worship team? And I'm like, I know my skills. I know my passions. I know how God's equipped me, and singing is not one of those things. And I'm okay with that. And be okay with those things. Be okay with letting other people star with how God's equipped them and trained them. Be okay with letting God star through you and how He's trained and equipped you. But also be okay to let God challenge you. Let Him stretch you a little bit into something new. I want to close this out by concluding with this very idea. That in all these things, man, if we are going to follow in Jesus' footsteps, if we are going to serve and love like Jesus did, it involves a great deal of our humility. It involves our selflessness. But if we're to do all that without genuine love for other people, we will struggle and trip up and fail. We can't do this aside from that. Paul writes, to go back to 1 Corinthians 13, he says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but I have not love, what is he? Clanging gong. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so to move mountains, but I have not love, nothing. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but I have not love, I've gained nothing. He concludes and says that, guys, love never ends. And as we know, now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. We love one another because God has first loved us. And my prayer is that in our church, that we would be a church that genuinely loves other people. You want the best for them. You want to serve them. You want to see others thrive and grow in their faith. We serve other people. This is so critical to living out this Christian life, to following Jesus, because He did it out of love for us. We can love each other. Let's love our neighbors. Let's love our community and seek the best for them. Let's seek the best for the person sitting around you in church. Let's seek the best for just people you're in a small group with. Let's love one another. We can't really do this aside from love, because otherwise we're just trying to dig deeper in ourselves and say, I just want to try to be really nice today. And it's more about you and your efforts rather than saying, no, I love that person, because love says it's not about me. Love says it's about them. It's about serving them. It's about becoming selfless. It's about being patient. It's about being kind. It's about enduring. It's about committing. It's love, not self-seeking. And so we can come and gather as God's people, and we can seek the interests of others because we love them. We can serve other people because we love them. Love carries a multitude of sins, doesn't it? We can carry a lot in love. We can carry a burden in love. And this kind of love, guys, is unique to the church. Should be very unique to the church. Jesus says, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen. Okay, and next week we'll talk a lot more about the whole Judas deal and everything that's going down with that. But as if Jesus saying to his guys right now, guys, this is the calling I'm putting on you, but I'm not talking about all of you. This expectation to follow in Jesus' footsteps is not one that, let's just, not to be judgmental in any way, but we don't expect this from the world. That's not our expectation. But it is the expectation that we love them, that we treat them with the same kindness and concern as others. But Jesus says that this kind of love and service for other people, this kind of humility, is a mark of Christian discipleship. It is a mark of following Jesus, because He is the one who has set the example for us. We are not reinventing something. We are following. We are disciples. We are students of the teacher, and His name's Jesus. So we follow in His example each and every day. Paul sums it up in 1 Corinthians 2. He says, guys, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though He was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied Himself by taking the form of a servant. Being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, He humbled Himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So may we have that mindset among us, that as Christ has done, so too we will follow.